okay, so everything is determined by these you know, like laws of physics and laws of nature and like the initial conditions. Okay, so why does that mean that there's no longer a distinction between voluntary action and involuntary action? How is that implied? It's not implied at all. Like, so even if we are just Coke cans fizzing, which I can think of a few relevant differences between human beings and Coke cans fizzing, but even if materialism is true, I can think of a few relevant differences. But why would that description of determinism entail that there's no distinction between me voluntarily doing something and doing something against my will involuntarily?
I would say that you don't. There is no such thing as voluntary.
Okay, so
I'm putting on Forrest here, guys. Just so you know, I'm saying what I think my brother would say. He'd say there is no such thing as voluntarily doing something. You're a chemical reaction. Certain things happen in the world, and then you react.
May I chime in as the physicalist here? Yeah, and this is a voluntary thing, Forrest, if in case you're watching.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's show. I am your host, Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith, and today joining me are two of my friends. First is Emerson Green. Emerson, how are you doing tonight?
Good. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Yeah, you were with me on the show before. We had a good conversation, so I thought I'd have you back for this one. And also joining us today for the first time, someone who I've wanted to talk to on the show for a while, and that is Tarik Lacour. Tarik, how are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you for having me, Jacob. It's an honor to be here, and also good to be with my good friend Emerson Green, who, for the first time in history, we actually agree about something on. So
I feel uncomfortable being
broken.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable being on the same side as you. I might just randomly bring up disagreements we have just to feel better.
Oh, you feel free to do that. I mean, the audience does deserve to be entertained.
Well, we'll try and keep this entertaining and informative for sure. So I actually first wanted to go into a little bit about why we're even having this conversation at all. So I saw an article that came out. I'm going to pull it up here on the screen for a moment. And it's an article by Robert Sapolsky, who has this article about not believing in free will. He's a Stanford biologist and neuroscientist. And anyway, it's kind of a controversial opinion. And my thought was, when I first saw this, was sort of like, well, duh. If you are someone, and you guys might cringe at this, but being more of a layman myself and not as good of a philosopher as you both, I look at this and I say, all right, if all that exists are, naturalistic material things, then then there can't be free will because it's all just matter in motion. Anyway, I'm going to say that's kind of the short thing that brought that up. But before we get into the discussion, I just realized I want you guys to very quickly tell the audience a little bit about your background, and so that way they know kind of where you're coming from and why you're interested in philosophy and that. So Emerson, could you give a quick kind of background about you and what you do online?
Yeah, so I've got a YouTube channel called Emerson Green, and if you prefer listening on podcasts, I have one called Counter Apologetics, which is about philosophy of religion, and another one called Walden Pod, where I talk about consciousness. So I'm an atheist and a non-physicalist, and I've debated Tarik before, actually, about that. And yeah, I mean, I was raised a Christian, and I'm not like I wouldn't call myself like a new atheist, but
thank heaven.
But I mean, I am fairly confident in atheism, and I am also fairly confident that physicalism is false, and I'm fairly confident that we have free will. But I'm agnostic whether determinism is true. So I have no idea if determinism is true. It might be. It makes a lot of sense to me. I kind of think determinism might be true for sort of principle of sufficient reason related reasons. So even in our agreement, Tarik, I still have like rationalist motivations for affirming determinism and that you wouldn't approve of. But anyway, so yeah, I think we do have free will, and I don't think it's incompatible with naturalism or atheism or anything like that.
Yeah, Emerson, I have to say to everyone that Emerson is one of the most interesting atheists that I've actually interacted with. A lot of atheists have a very sort of prepackaged, like, exactly what they're going to say every time, but Emerson has really interesting takes on things. So I encourage people to follow you on Twitter, check out your podcasts and stuff.
Thank
So
you.
I'm glad to have you on the show. And Tarik, go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also a master's student in physics. So I work in the philosophy of physics, general philosophy of science, and environmental ethics. So that's kind of my broad overview there. More particularly, I work on general relativity and quantum mechanics, trying to see how those work together. So loop quantum gravity, things like that. Those are my really big areas that I'm working on for my dissertation. And unlike Emerson, I am a compatibilist, but I am a physicalist. So I think that there's only the natural world, and it's only all of the natural world is physical. There are no non-physical properties of the world. I did want to make a brief correction to what you said. You said matter and motion would be everything if you're a physicalist. Not quite right, because light and energy are not matter. So moving that back a little bit. But
Okay.
but they're still physical. And I am a determinist because I am a proponent of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So because I accept that theory, I am a determinist. I guess I would agree with Emerson, though, that even if I wasn't a determinist, I would still believe in free will, but I wouldn't be a libertarian about free will. So I would see that whether determinism is true or false, I think you could have free will, but I do believe in determinism. So,
okay. So I want to kind of show people where I'm at. So I always consider myself an amateur level philosopher trying to sort through stuff. I try and make arguments for things that I believe, but I also don't consider myself a highly trained philosopher because I'm not. So I want to very quickly,
neither
though.
were Spinoza or Hume. You're fine. Go ahead.
Well, I want to show real quick a few of the ideas that I have and the way that I sort of frame the whole free will debate, because I think it's a way a lot of people think of it, at least the ones that I interact with. And you guys can kind of start to give me some corrections on some of these things. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to take a look at sort of this determinism, free will, compatibilism from the way that I kind of see it. And we can see where I'm wrong here. So first of all, determinism, as I understand it, is the idea that all events, including all human action, are ultimately determined by causes that are external to the will. Okay, so they aren't things that I chose to have happen. There was no choice involved. There was no will involved. It was just cause and effect. Okay, and then I see now I conflate free will and agency a lot of the time. The way I sort of define it when I use the term is I'm talking about the capacity to choose between available options. Okay, so what I mean by that is
You can do A or not A.
A or not A, but also when I talk about freedom, that in my mind is the amount of options that are available. Like I have more freedom if I have more options to choose from, but that's separate in my mind from the ability to actually make a choice between the options that are out there. And as I define that, I look at, okay, a person can have agency is more that capacity rather than the availability of options. Okay. So last one is compatibilism. And this is the idea that these two concepts are not incompatible with one another. So I actually would probably consider myself an incompatibilist because from my perspective, I don't know how those two are reconciled, which I'll go into. But before we get into any of that, I wanted to, are these definitions fair? Am I thinking about this clearly, or am I definitionally messed up?
I don't think what you're saying is unfair. But I think we should clear up a few things. So basically, there are two camps in the free will debate. So you have incompatibilists and compatibilists. And now, ironically, some incompatibilists they're on the same team, even if they go the opposite route. So let's start with determinism. So determinism itself is a very controversial thing. There's not one way to define it. Different determinists define it differently. But something like this will probably be sufficient. And I think, Emerson, you can You'll probably agree with this.
Oh, I actually don't agree.
Okay, fine.
I think that the definition of determinism is problematic because you specified external to the will,
Hmm.
but the will can just be part of that domino causal chain, you know.
Yeah.
So like determinism is not the view that your will makes no difference to what happens. So like some people view determinism as kind of like being a blue voter in Wyoming or like a red voter in New York, just like no matter what you do, the outcome is going to be the same. But that's not what determinism means. I guess if you're looking for a word for that, fatalism might be closer,
Yeah,
but
that's closer.
determinism, I'm quoting from the SEP, just means the idea that every event is necessitated by antecedent events and conditions together with the laws of nature. So you've got these laws of nature, you've got these initial conditions of a system, and whatever happens is sort of entailed from those initial conditions and those laws of nature. So, you know, so again, I'm quoting, causal determinism is roughly speaking the idea that every event is necessitated by antecedent events together with the laws
So,
of nature.
so maybe
When I
what I'm
said you'd
talking
agree
about is
with
more of
I was gonna
fatalism.
oh, sorry. I was going to say
I
that
was,
Emerson. I said you were going to agree with the definition of determinism I was about to give, not the definition of determinism he had up.
Oh, okay.
So,
got
and
it.
that was kind of where I was going with that. But you
So
cleared
it's
it
funny, and
up.
I pulled that right off of I think Wikipedia, or maybe it was the Oxford Dictionary,
Yeah.
right? That I pulled that from. So that is one of the things that's very difficult about this whole subject, is because people begin to use the term determinist or whatever, and they're not necessarily talking about the same things. And so when I talk about it, I guess what I'm really talking about is fatalism. Is that the term that's more accurate to describe what I'm talking about?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about like, well, what I do doesn't matter, my will doesn't factor into the causal chain. Like, I mean, even fatalism might not be totally accurate. I just don't think that that's anyone's view that's being defended. Like, oh, it doesn't matter what you do, you know, whether or not you're there, the exact same things will happen. Like, determinists believe that your will is a part of the causal chain, even if they're incompatibilists. I mean, I'm a
So
compatibilist.
but that would have to say, though, that there is some capacity to choose between available options, right?
Yeah, and I did just notice the word ultimately in that slide. If you put that back up, I missed that before. So that word ultimately bothers me sometimes because it seems to imply that like, oh, proximate causes don't really count. So if your will is just the proximate cause, then it doesn't really count as being the cause. But I think that's not really justifiable. But I guess if you yeah, I mean, so that definition of determinism might be a little more defensible with that qualification ultimately, because yeah, your will is going to be caused by things that are outside of your control if you go back far enough in the causal
Yeah,
chain.
which is to say that your will, even though if it's part of the causal chain, your will isn't yours. It is what you have been given due to the circumstances of nature.
No, it's still yours.
I think what you're getting at is kind of something that one of Emerson's heroes gets at, and that's kind of, if you to be free, you have to be like a causa sui. You have to be the cause of yourself, or nothing else made you what you are except you, kind of the thing. And Strawson agrees with you, but he says, but since you can't be that, you don't have free will. So, yeah, it might be ultimately, like, for example, you're not responsible for the laws of nature. We don't create those. We don't create the initial conditions of the world, things like that. But that doesn't mean that you haven't evolved traits and characteristics that will help shape what happens in the world. You're given a kind of an ability that nothing else that we know of in the cosmos has. So certainly, even though you are the byproduct of natural law and natural forces, that doesn't mean that you're not very different from most things that are the byproducts of those same types of processes. I think, but I do see what you're getting at. There's this kind of common sense hunch that if it's not all up to me, then none of it's up to me, and I think that's wrong.
Well, and Sapolsky, I can't remember his name, how to say it exactly,
Mhm.
but he in that article, his thing is like, yeah, it is all ultimately the laws of nature. Your will is determined by the laws of nature, and so ultimately it comes down to the laws of nature are the things running the show. We are essentially a chemical reaction playing itself out, and we are part of that chemical reaction, but it's just the chemical reaction is going to play itself out the way it's going to play itself out. And you can't change that, right? It's like the rock is rolling down the hill. It's going to go where it's going to go according to the laws of physics.
Great example. So
I think you gave that example before.
yeah, yes, I did. In fact, I wrote when I was doing I was starting off in philosophy, and I was going to do a master's in neuroscience, and I wrote a paper on this subject for one of my professors who what's his name, Sapolsky, is that right?
Yeah, I think it's
He is
Sapolsky.
also a hard determinist, and I gave this example. I said, look, you can compare. Do either of you ski?
I do.
When I was a kid, yeah.
I've never been skiing, so bear with me here. So you roll a boulder down a mountain. The ball just keeps going, gaining momentum, and eventually, if it flattens out, it'll stop. If not, it'll just roll on forever. Okay, you go down that same mountain. You can understand that you can speed up, you can slow down, you can go this way, you can go that way, you can do jumps and tricks, and you can understand what you do can affect the future of what's about to come. So that shows you, even though you're governed by the same laws, even though you are just as physical as the rock, you have a sense of responsibility that the rock doesn't. For example, if you saw, okay, let's say there's a kid in front of you on the way down the hill. If you're a skier, you can know, okay, either I can move out of the way or I can just bear down and I could knock the kid down. You'd be responsible for that. The rock would just crush the kid, keep moving. We wouldn't prosecute the rock for what it did to the kid. So it shows you, again, just being physical and law governed doesn't mean that you don't have any control or responsibility in what's going on. And as long as you can see that, that's all the compatibilist really needs to have free will.
Okay.
Now, I mean, I would say this, and I think this is what you're getting at. The way we've been describing free will, if you're a compatibilist, it doesn't seem to capture kind of the magical wonder sometimes of what you might think of when you think of free will from a common sense layperson perspective. But there you are.
So let's take a look at this real quick. So this is the way that I frame it, and why I would say I'm an incompatibilist, at least as far as sort of the definition of determinism that I put out. And maybe it is, but I look at, okay, so you have a stimulus A, it by necessity of the laws of nature produces response B. If I pour oil into water, they will separate, right? It is determined by the laws of nature that stimulus A will result in response B. Now, actually, I got this from Stephen Covey, and his book. I remember when I read this in his book and I saw this diagram, I thought it was really brilliant. And it's been the way that I've thought about free will basically ever since. And that is that human beings are different in that we are hit by influences. The gravity does pull us down the hill as the skier, right? Like there are things that are beyond our control. These are what I would call also influences, but that we choose our response to those influences to the degree that we can, right? To the degree that there are options available, we have the capacity to choose if I'm going to go left around that tree, right around that tree, or if I'm going to go down the hill at all. And so, but obviously once I'm going down the hill, I have limited the options because there are forces that can constrain what I say is my freedom or the options available to me. But amongst the options available, I still have a capacity to kind of go left and right, right? And one other example of this that I would point to is, and Covey talks about it in his book, is the last of all human freedoms, right? That Viktor Frankl talked about when he was in the concentration camp. He said, look, all of these external stimulus can exist, but I always have the ability to choose how I'm going to respond to the stimulus that are given to me, right? Mm-hmm. And so the question I ask is, the hard determinist would look at that and say, nope, this is not the way it is, because ultimately, let's go back to that word, ultimately, any way you choose to respond is due to your upbringing, due to the neurochemistry that you have, due to the circumstances that you're in. And so how you respond, response B, is ultimately determined by stimulus A, which can be a massive amount of various things that make up who you are. So that's the way I kind of view the two options that are available. And I'm curious, is that off? What am I missing?
No, I mean, I don't think it's off exactly. I just think that when you think about free will as most people do, which is you need to have some kind of significant control over your actions, and there have to be multiple possibilities open to you. And I just think that that is compatible with determinism. So like you're saying like stimulus A is going to necessitate, the reaction B. But I just don't think that is a problem for freedom or responsibility. So Dennett gives this example in Elbow Room where he talks about Martin Luther saying, "I can do no other," when he was told to recant. And he said this, his conscience compels him, he can't ignore it. He can do no other. And Dennett says, well, look, whatever he was trying to do, he was not trying to duck responsibility. He was not saying, well, I can do no other, so I'm not responsible. So you can be in a situation where you can't really do otherwise, but you still clearly feel responsible for what you did. So like
just because you feel responsible doesn't mean you actually are. If I have an epileptic seizure,
oh, he is
and because of that,
I mean, like he like his conscience is the reason that he couldn't do otherwise. So like Dennett gives this other example where he says, like, you can bribe me $1,000 to torture someone. I'm just never going to do it. Like you can say, here's $1,000. Like, if you go torture that guy, it's yours. He's like, look, I'm never going to do that. Like I can do no other. Like you're not going to bribe me for, you're not going to give me $1,000 and, entice me to torture someone. But if you ask why that is, responsibility still ultimately lies with me. It is because of me and my nature and the way that I am. That's why I can do no other, and that's why I'm responsible, because of my nature and who I am. So here I don't really have alternate possibilities in this deep sense that an incompatibilist wants, but I still have moral responsibility.
I also would object a little bit. I think that your illustration uses a really good point. So you talked about, I think it was water and oil kind of separating due to laws of nature. Well, let's step back a little bit. This is actually relevant to my work in physics. So what exactly do you think laws of nature are? Because I think this is actually a big component of this.
And that's the thing. Are they a description of what happens in the physical world, or are they the actual cause of what happens in the world? And I think that in my mind is, but then it begs the question, well, then what the heck is the cause? Right.
Right. So the reason I bring that up is because certain people who are incompatibilists try to run this type of laws of nature argument just to show why compatibilism can't work. Peter van Inwagen is the most principal advocate of this incompatibilist argument, where he says, okay, if determinism is true, then what happens is the result of laws of nature in the past, and I'm not responsible for the laws of nature or the past, so I can't be responsible for what I do. So
well,
that's
and
the whole thing. Now, there are a few things wrong with that. First of all, I would take the view, first of all, that laws of nature are just descriptions of what happens. They're not things. So laws of nature don't cause anything. You could, frankly, I'm somewhat becoming kind of an eliminativist about laws of nature. I think you should just stop talking about it that way, because too many people think that there's like the physical stuff and then there's these like things that make it do what it does, rather than just saying, this is what happens. There you go. So you take that part out. The other is, we have very good examples from biology. And Emerson was talking about this, and from the same book, where Dennett talks about you can stimulate a type of a beetle, and they'll for a lot of types of beetles, they'll just keep running into the stimulus. But if you certain types of beetles, they will react and not go towards it anymore. The same thing would be true of a dog. If you kick a dog, it can feel pain and be like, you know what, if I do this tends to happen. So the same is kind of true of human beings. It's true that there were physical matter and things like that, but we do have abilities that things like water and oil don't. We can understand why things happen. We can make predictions. We can have reservations. We can weigh among options. even though we are law-governed things. So and that's all you really need for moral responsibility, is to have it be the case that did the person understand what they were doing? Did they understand what would happen? Do they understand why they should or shouldn't do that? And then if they do, then we'll say that person was free and it's morally responsible. And if not, then we won't hold them morally responsible. There are lots of people who don't have free will. For example, I have a soon to be 1-year-old baby. Audrey doesn't have free will. She doesn't know why she does what she does. So she's not free and morally responsible. Chloe is 3. She's turning 4. So she's got a little bit of free will. And then people like me and yourself, we have a lot more. And as we age, things will change, but we have degrees of freedom that are all we need for moral responsibility. We don't need to make ourselves special in order to have free will.
Well, and I would look at it and say, I going back to sort of this idea of agency and free will. Okay. I look at it as agency as our ability to choose between options. Now, obviously, your daughter, or I have a 4-year-old son right now, and I have 4 kids, so I know how it goes when they're younger, and they're not morally responsible because their level of capacity to choose between those options is much more limited because of a lack of knowledge and other things. However, as we grow, it's like almost like our capacity to understand and to choose between options, and therefore our moral accountability for the choices that we make, becomes more. We become, I use this analogy. I say we're animals, but we don't have to be, right? Like we are influenced by all of these natural forces, but
We're more than our impulses, is what you're saying, I think.
Exactly. And that capacity is what makes us a human being, right? That's something that the ability to reason and do those sorts of things, we're larger. I wouldn't say we're different maybe in kind to a certain degree we are ultimately animals in that sense, but we are a very, very special animal that can do things that no other animal seems to be able to do. And therefore, that's why when a lion kills a zebra, we don't charge it with murder and put him in lion jail. But I want to say something to what you said, Emerson, where you said you were talking about kind of who you are, but do you have any control over who you are? Right? Like if you're making choices because of your character, but isn't your character ultimately, and I use that word, ultimately shaped by forces outside of your control? And so if you were born in Afghanistan, you'd be someone totally different?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I hope that the libertarian or incompatibilist view can accommodate the fact that if we were born in Afghanistan, we'd be different. So yeah, I mean, of course I'd be different, but it's like, my character does determine what I do in part. And if you just want to take a step back and say, yeah, but why do you have that character? It's like, well, that's an interesting question, but it doesn't change the fact that I do what I do in part because of the way that I am. So it's kind of like, this is something the incompatibilist does a lot that kind of bothers me, because it's like if I said, well, hang on, that faucet over there is a source of water. And I feel like the incompatibilist would say, well, no, it's not, because it's connected to pipes. It's like, well, no, the faucet is a source of water. Just because you can go a little farther back in the chain doesn't mean the faucet is somehow not a source. So it's like, I am the source of my actions. And you say, well, hang on, if you had different genes, you'd be behaving differently. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm still the source of my actions. I don't have to be like the unmoved mover to be the source of my actions. Just like the faucet can be a source of water without being like, spontaneously creating water that pops into existence every time I turn the faucet on.
See, and I real quick on that, I think my theory is that we all are unmoved movers. We have that capacity. That's what agency is.
But you
It's
could
the
still
ability to,
be a source though without being an unmoved mover.
well, I would say it in this sense. I can receive stimulus by my character, my upbringing, my environment, but every time I make a choice, I am choosing the response to that stimulus, and that shapes my character. the more I make certain choices, the more my character changes, and I actually alter the sort of being that I am. And so my future of what I am is not determined merely by antecedent causes, but rather by the way that I respond to the stimuluses that I get. Now, am I wrong?
Okay, let's. I will answer that. I think maybe this is kind of the idea of. I think of free will as an emergent phenomenon. In other words, as a naturalist, I would be a poetic naturalist, similar to Sean Carroll. I don't know if you know who Sean Carroll is. He's a physicist and philosopher
I
at
do.
Johns Hopkins. If you're looking for free will at the level of physics, you certainly don't have free will. If you're looking at it from even just at basic biology, no, you don't have free will. Free will is an emergent human phenomenon. So,
A
yeah,
property of consciousness, I would say. It's something that emerges along with consciousness. Conscious beings experience free will. I don't think it.
Okay, well, I'm not going to get into the consciousness debate, but
It's all right.
so that's one thing. So because you it seems like you keep saying like if it has to be at this very top level, free will can't be emergent. It is almost what you seem to be saying.
I would
It
push
can't
back.
emerge from other things.
I think, well, being someone who
Because if you
falls into the
think you can,
panpsychist
it
camp,
seems to be
I think it
emergentism seems
emerges.
to play into the compatibilist hands a bit. Because
Well,
if you're an emergentist, then it wasn't all up to you that emerged. You're still shaped by it and constrained by it.
I would say you're influenced by it, but you're not necessarily constrained by it, right?
Yeah.
I believe that the influences emerge from that, but you as an agent always ultimately can choose your response to the stimulus. I think that it is something that can never be taken away.
Okay, now here's where I'm going to this is something you keep saying. Well, it's up to me among all these other things. Okay, what exactly is this you?
And that's this is actually funny. That's where I go, I don't understand. If I don't have agency, if I don't have free will, I don't even know what I am, because the I, the me, the self is that thing which has the ability to choose. Like that's it,
Well,
almost like
what
the
is
essential
it?
characteristic
I'm
of
serious. What are you? I mean, because here's the
I
thing.
would say as a panpsychist, I would say that I
Oh,
am that me and Emerson are going to get on the same page and say that my consciousness, which includes this capacity for free will, is emergent from the physical properties that I have, including the spiritually physical properties that I have, that are all inherent within the same panpsychist thing. So, to get a little wild.
you have to go that far to say free will. That's pretty remarkable. Okay, so
Well,
you-
I mean, unfortunately, like Spinoza was a panpsychist and he didn't believe in free will. He would not be
yes.
outside, unfortunately.
Oh, and Galen Strawson is a panpsychist and doesn't believe in free will.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
I don't mean to derail things, but could I take a step back and kind of explain
Yeah. Yeah.
trajectory?
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I agree with you that like my agency, my conscious deliberation plays a role in how the future will unfold. So where I was and where I am now, I used to think that like when I first got into philosophy, I thought compatibilism was like obviously wrong and kind of a joke. Like I thought that they were just obviously redefining free will. Like they're just playing word games. It was just very irritating to me. Like Dan Dennett drove me insane. But just like the more I looked into the debates, the compatibilists started making more and more sense to me. And now compatibilism almost seems like trivially true. So that's a major transition over like 5 or 6 years. So, and like Tarik mentioned, I'm not sure if this was before we started recording, but compatibilism is actually the majority view among philosophers, which is, surprising considering how unpopular it is outside of academia. But I'll just say, like, I have the incompatibilist intuition. Like, prima facie, it seems like free will and determinism are just like obviously incompatible. Like that doesn't make any sense. But when I ask why that is, I just never get a good answer. So like I've kind of been moved over to the compatibilist side. Actually, a libertarian, so like a fellow incompatibilist, um, Michael Humer, he said in his book Knowledge, Reality, and Value, he said, something the compatibilist analysis of free will has going for it is that every time a philosopher tries to carefully analyze free will, they come up with a compatibilist analysis. So it's like every time you try to like define free will, you end up defining something that is not incompatible with determinism, and you have to actually try really hard to come
But
up with a version of free will that's not.
That's
well,
why I've
like,
been nodding my head this entire head while Jacob's been saying, it's like, but I don't see why that has to make me a libertarian.
see,
Well,
but I feel like we're playing with labels here, and we can throw the different labels on things for determinists, compatibilists, and we can argue about those definitions. I'm just trying to understand at the level of not language and the label, but at the level of the notion of, okay, do human beings have the capacity to choose? And if they do, in my mind, and use whatever language we want, I think that those who don't think that human beings have the capacity to choose, like my brother, for instance, or at least he leans that direction. He says human beings, or I think Sapolsky
mhm.
has this, the hard determinist view. Human beings don't ultimately choose anything. We're just our chemical reactions playing ourselves out, right?
Well,
And
you can be a hard incompatibilist too, just for the viewer's sake, to say you can affirm whether determinism is true or false, or what you just said, so we can't have free will either way.
well, see, in my mind, there's the binary. Either A, we have the capacity to make choices between options, or we don't. Our choices, what option we will choose, is not our choice, but is determined by other factors outside of the will,
Okay.
ultimately.
I think maybe here we can kind of, as compatibilists, we can define what we mean by freedom and kind of get that out there, and then we can kind of critique it that way, so we're not shouting in a box. So I believe, and we'll do it this way because Emerson, as we set off air, is a non-determinist compatibilist, meaning he doesn't affirm determinism or deny it. He's agnostic about it, but I affirm determinism, as I am a mini World Series of quantum mechanics. So I think it's deterministic all the way down. So to me, what to be free means that you can do what you want to do and no one else forced you to do it. So as long as I can pick up the cell phone like I did, as long as I can go down the street, as long as I can choose to do what I want to do, and there isn't some person or agent making me do other things, that I'm free. So my version of free will is very close to David Hume's in The Treatise of Human Nature, or Thomas Hobbes. So because I am a determinist. Also, I think this is important, and this is this isn't why I'm a determinist, but it's always struck me as very true. If determinism was false, it's not clear to me how you would have free will, because your actions would be random. It wouldn't seem how, if determinism is false, for example, determinism really seems to mean same past, same future, versus incompatibilism would say same past, different futures. So, in other words, if determinism was false, there would be no real reason for me to believe that when I stand up, that the laws of physics are going to maintain in the future just like they have in the past. On determinism, I can have full confidence in that. Indeterminism, I hope it works out. So that's where I would define free will: the ability to do what you want to do without constraint. And that would go back
And
to what I was talking about earlier. That is an ability that evolves over time. So when you're a baby, you don't have it. When you become more of a mature adult, you have it. You become morally responsible. Over time, you may lose it again. Now, my view is very deflationist. So that's it's not that wide out there. It's much more deflated than yours was, I would say. But Emerson, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I guess I would just pause there. So, I mean, you would grant, right, Jacob, that what Tarik just said, like, well, I mean, that's compatible with determinism. If it's like, well, there's a distinction between doing what I want and being compelled by someone else to do something that I don't want to do.
yeah, and that's what I think what's going on here, and I think it just maybe is linguistic stuff, is that the definitions of determinism that are being used, because it sounds to me like the definition of determinism that's being used is essentially that things have, like, effects have causes, right? And so if everything has a cause, every effect has a cause, then those causes determine the effects. And is that sort of the view of determinism? I'm having trouble understanding like what you mean by determinism.
Hans Reichenbach, who is a philosopher in the 20th century, he called this thing called the principle of the common cause, which is like same cause, same effect. So that's how I would kind of view causation, as a determinist all the way down.
Okay. So same cause, same effect. So if a person
were false, it would basically mean that I could throw the ball at the wall one time and the ball would bounce and come off. I could throw at the ball at another time, same way, and it wouldn't, because it's indeterminate.
Yeah, and that's sort of at the heart of the question is, are human beings like balls? Where you get the exact same set of circumstances to a human being, literally same genetics, same everything. Would they do the exact same thing? Which would mean that the option that you choose amongst the options available, there's an illusion of choice, but there isn't actually a choice there. You are like the ball, and you will go to where these forces beyond you push you into whatever option's there. That's kind of I'm having trouble understanding how that's compatible if indeed what I do isn't determined by this thing I call the me.
Because my brain and the laws of physics aren't throwing me around. They're giving me the sufficient conditions to allow me to do what I want to do.
And so the me, who is the me in that question? Like,
well, for me, the me is my brain and my body.
I think it's my mind, but
I'm with you.
He's not a physicalist, so that would be the point.
Go ahead.
I mean,
Emerson.
I think that it is true that if human beings, if you replicate every single condition and like so the person involved is the same, their nature is the same, the state of their mind is exactly the same, and everything around them is exactly the same. Well, yeah, I think it is going to follow that they're going to do the same thing. But I don't think that means that it wasn't freely chosen. So like you can put a few options in front of me and I'm going to predictably choose one of them over and over again. Like if
but if it's predictive that you likely will due to the influences on you, but are you causally determined to have to choose option C, or is it that you actually could have chosen otherwise?
Well, I mean, what do you mean by could have done otherwise? Do you mean that if I had tried, I would have succeeded? Because in that sense, I could have done otherwise. If I had tried to do C or D or E or F, then I would have succeeded if I tried to do those things. And there are other things that I couldn't have done, even if I had tried. If I had tried, I wouldn't have succeeded. So I wasn't free to do those things, but I was free to do the things that if I had tried, I would have succeeded.
I would say I'm not looking at if you're successful. I'm saying as which of those would you have even tried in the first place, whether or not you achieve it or not. It's if you would have gone after that particular goal or not. Where is your will directed by this thing we would call the you, your mind, or is it directed simply, are you dancing to the music of your DNA?
Well, I mean, so this is my arm, right? And like, even though it's produced by DNA and it has a bunch of prior causes that led to it being here, it's still my arm. It's not like not my arm because it was caused by like genetics and, like my environment. And if the prenatal environment had been different, my arm would be different. Okay, but it's still my arm. So like, I feel the same way about my will. It is my will. It's not someone else's. And it is, if determinism is true, well, it's still a domino in that causal chain, and things would be different if I didn't exist. Like my will still plays a causal role, and me being who I am is still going to change the way the universe is, regardless of whether determinism is true.
But wouldn't the universe, like, I guess there's that question, if a person with a particular genetic makeup, set of socio-historical circumstances, all of that kind of stuff all come together, and then we can know what their future actions will be based on that, then can't we apply that to you and say that your future is going to be what it's going to be regardless, because ultimately your future is not determined by this thing you call you, but rather is determined by these antecedent forces that are going to, like, can your future be otherwise than it's going to be?
Well, I mean, let's just bite the bullet and say my future can't be otherwise than it's going to be. Does that mean I'm not free? Well, no, it doesn't. So, like, let's make it a little more concrete, because what you're
See,
saying
and
right now,
I'm kind of like, I don't understand that. So
I know. So,
go
like,
ahead.
let me just apply what you just said to a specific scenario. So,
Mhm.
I'm gonna borrow the same example from Dennett. Like, we could even use one of your kids or something. So, I assume that you're a good parent, you're raising your kids right, and they were not going to torture someone even if you give them $1,000. So, like, I assume that, but the thing is, like, that's determined. Like, they're not
How
psychos,
about
and they're
2,000?
well, I said I stipulated 1,000. So,
Sorry, Jacob. I had to.
so I
I
think
don't
it
know if
is
it's enough money. I
determined.
might.
Well, yeah, well, that's why I stipulated 1,000, because it's obviously that's never going to be enough. So, um, the thought is that, like, okay, given the genes of your children, given their environment, they're being
Could I make
raised by a good person, so they literally could not do otherwise. They are never going to do it, no matter what little minute changes you might make. Like, they are never going to do that. They couldn't have done otherwise because of their genes and upbringing. And yet, I still think they're responsible for their choice to not torture someone.
see, but that's because I actually would disagree.
Hmm.
I wouldn't disagree that they would do it. It's that they have the capacity to do it. They could have chosen to torture someone in exchange for $1,000. It's not outside of their ability to do it. I have the ability to make that choice, but because of my character and the choices that not only that I have made, but they have made, and all of that. And obviously some of that is just natural biology. I do think that there's that factor, but I do think that there are causal agents in there that help to mold the character of others, and that character is the reason that they won't do it. But had they lived in some other culture and had their character not been formed a particular way, they have the capacity to choose, and they might give into that capacity. So I'm not talking about what someone will do as much as I'm talking about what they have the capacity to do.
Yeah, so
Agents
But
I
I
think
don't
that
see
you
why.
just I think
But
you
I
just
don't see
walked
why
into a
given.
perfect compatibilist analysis here, because of could have done otherwise. Because what you just said is something like what I would say if I were arguing with my friend John Buck about this, because he's convinced that this could have done otherwise principle is so essential to free will, and we need alternative possibilities or else we're not free. And what I always say is, look, we do have alternate possibilities in the sense that you just said with your children torturing someone for $1,000. Like, can I conceive of that happening? Well, yes. I mean, like, I can imagine that happening. Like, it's epistemically possible, I guess, that might happen. So I do have alternative possibilities. It is like there are multiple options available to me in this weaker sense of epistemic possibility. So you do have alternative possibilities. You could have done otherwise, even though we all know the future is only going to unfold one way. There's only one way things are going to actually go here. But because we can conceive of people doing otherwise, because it's epistemically possible that they could have done otherwise, you do have a substantive notion of alternative possibilities. So if that's essential to free will, then you've got what you need, and it's fully compatible with determinism, because all it requires is that you can conceive of alternative possibilities.
And my only response to that would be that I'm not saying that if I can conceive of alternative possibilities, I'm talking about that if human beings actually have the capacity for a different choice to be made,
Sure
right?
they do.
Because
Well, I think
capacity
that if they
and
tried, they
I
would
don't
I just
I,
succeed. So I think they do have the capacity in the sense that if they tried, they would succeed. But I just don't think they're ever going to make that choice.
okay. Tarik.
yeah, I'm not seeing the problem either epistemically or practically. I have the ability to raise my right arm or put it down or uh, torture the person or not. It's certainly within my physical capacity to do, even if upbringing and other decision making has made it basically not going to happen that I'll do certain things. Um, so Not seeing the problem. I mean, unless someone is unless someone is forcing me to do something, then it seems to be I'm free.
So I'm going to put
I
on
don't
my,
think that the laws of nature or your genes or your biology force you to do things.
so I'm going to,
That's not what laws or genes do. I
so, and
think this is the problem with people like Saplonsky and others. They tend to make it like your genes or laws of physics are like these people that hold guns to your head and make you, or maybe better if you don't like that in light of the mass shooting. Also, rest in peace to those people in Maine. Like it makes you some sort of puppet that the laws of physics just make you do things. That's not true either. So again, we can be fully confident in determinism and in our ability to be free, as long as we have certain abilities. And again, that means that sometimes we do have free will, sometimes we don't. Also, I think there's a good argument to be a compatibilist this way if you really want to preserve free will. We don't know if determinism is true or false. But if you're pretty sure you have free will, then you're probably going to want to hold on to some notion of it that can survive either determinism being true or false, as we don't know which way it's going to turn out. So that's another pragmatic reason to be a compatibilist, I think. If you're a libertarian, you're really biting the bullet and saying, determinism is false and we have free will. But ultimately, it's an empirical question whether determinism is true or false. And since we don't have a full account of quantum theory and general relativity fused yet, we're not sure which one is going to turn out to be right.
Okay. So I'm going to put on the hat of my brother, the Latter-day skeptic, Forrest Hansen, and try and basically give what I think he would say. I actually was tempted to bring him into this conversation, but I figured we had so many voices, it'd be kind of crazy. He tends to be a hard determinist. And I want to kind of show what I think is sort of the logic that he has. And I want to try and poke holes in those who are the hard determinists. So I'm going to put on the screen here, and maybe this isn't perfectly formulated linguistically, but there's a particular idea about the world that people have. And that is, and we kind of talked about this, Tarik, before the show and online actually chatting. But the first premise here is that all that exists is material, or maybe we could say all that exists is that which is physical. And that the motion of all material is determined by X, and X is the law of physics. And so the conclusion then follows that the laws of physics are what determine all motion. Now, I threw this together kind of quickly, so it might be a little sloppy, but just this idea that, look, we are just a bunch of, kind of going all the way back to, I think Epicurus had this same idea, that we were,
too.
Yeah, that we essentially are nothing more than material. Material moves around in certain ways. That motion is determined by laws outside of ourself. We are, and I've heard this before, that we are just a chemical reaction playing ourselves out. We are no different than a Coke can fizzing. And that's all humanity is Coke cans fizzing and playing themselves out. There is no free will. It's all an illusion. And I think that argument, given certain assumptions about the universe, is pretty airtight. Why is it wrong?
So I don't think it's just a linguistic issue, and I get the spirit of what's being said. So I don't mean to like nitpick or something like that. That's definitely not my intention. And like I said earlier, I do have like the incompatibilist intuition here. But I'm just saying when I scrutinize it, when I like think about it harder, it kind of goes away. So, okay, so everything is determined by these like laws of physics and laws of nature and like the initial conditions. Okay, so why does that mean that there's no longer a distinction between voluntary action and involuntary action? How is that implied? It's not implied at all. Like, so even if we are just Coke cans fizzing, which I can think of a few relevant differences between human beings and Coke cans fizzing, but even if materialism is true, I can think of a few relevant differences. But why would that description of determinism entail that there's no distinction between me voluntarily doing something and doing something against my will involuntarily?
I would say that you don't. There is no such thing as voluntary.
Okay, so
I'm putting on Forrest here, guys. Just so you know, I'm saying what I think my brother would say. He'd say there is no such thing as voluntarily doing something. You're just You're a chemical reaction.
No,
Certain things
there's
happen in
a
the world, and then you react.
may I chime in as the physicalist here? Yeah, and this is a voluntary thing for us, if in case you're watching. Can you play that? Can you put that back on the screen? I like.
Yeah, I'll put it back on the screen.
Okay.
And
Okay.
he
All
didn't
that
put this
exists.
together. I did, trying to
Okay,
steal
that's fine.
man.
All that exists is material or physical. Okay, that's fine. So that's saying this is premise one will be the assertion that physicalism is true. So Emerson could already get off the train because he could just deny premise one. I can't because I'm a physicalist, so I agree with that. Then he says that it's the laws of physics that makes the material move. Is that right? It's all
Yeah, the
determined by
motion,
okay.
but
Well,
determined by X, and we're
by
saying X. And now I put this together intentionally this way because I wanted to separate X from the laws of physics, because I actually think the big question is what is X, but he would say that X is the laws of physics.
well, if it's the laws of physics, then I think that even though the conclusion is right, I think this is a logically valid argument. It leaves out things like emergent properties and things like that, which are fundamental to physicalism. So
I see. And Forrest,
so just because matter itself at its base component, whether that be quarks or atoms or whatever else we will find out in quantum mechanics, that doesn't mean, I mean, first of all, this is kind of I think this is the problem. People think that, okay, you're made of X, and let's say this is material, and X doesn't have this, so therefore you can't. Well, no. I mean, even though you're made of matter, you're made of it in a different way, and the properties you have aren't there in matter. For example, take an
but
easy example
wouldn't that would that refute would that?
that you
Oh, go
can't
ahead.
disagree with. I would think it's true that you would agree that if you put hydrogen and oxygen together, you will get water, and the property of being wet. That's true. Okay, but hydrogen alone isn't wet, and oxygen alone isn't wet. You won't find that property in either one, no matter how deep you go down. You have to put them together. You get this emergent property, and free will and control over what you do. While a quark may not have it, a human being can have it.
Yeah,
Okay, so
that's
real
an
quick,
important point actually that Tarik has mentioned a couple times, that there are degrees of freedom.
Right.
That it's not this binary thing, like you either have free will or don't have it. Like we obviously attribute different levels of freedom and responsibility to different human beings, like people at different ages. Like we have different laws for people who are at different ages, and we
and
treat people.
I call that different levels of not freedom. I call it different levels of agency, right? Freedom, I would say, are the options available to you, but agency is that capacity to choose, like knowing what you're choosing, right?
Well, there are things that can limit the options available to you.
Yeah.
So I feel like you know, that does track with freedom. You know, like if you're a child, there are literally less options available to you than if you're a fully functional adult. And if you're not a fully functional adult, if you have like severe brain damage, you are not in the same level of control as someone who does not have like brain damage or a tumor. So the thing is, these distinctions are all still there, even if determinism is true. Like there's obviously a difference between someone who's in control of themselves and someone who is out of control. Like there's still a difference between making me do something with a gun to my head, that would be involuntary, and me doing something because I want to, that would be voluntary. So that's not incompatible with determinism. And, you know, similarly, there's a difference between intentionally throwing a Coke can at Forrest and accidentally dropping a Coke can on Forrest. You know, like you would treat me very differently based on.
Would you say though that it's incompatible? Because when I say determinism, I'm talking about hard determinism. Is it incompatible with hard determinism?
No, I mean, like I can intentionally or accidentally do something, even if determinism is true.
I think a lot of hard determinists actually end up being compatibilists in the end anyway. Here's a good example historically. We mentioned Spinoza. Spinoza talks about we don't have free will, but he does say, but you do have freedom. And the type of freedom he will talk about is basically what compatibilists will say, like, yeah, that's the kind that is necessary for moral praise and blame. He just doesn't see it quite the same way. Now, ironically enough, for the people who deny free will, most of them aren't hard determinists. There are very few hard determinists in philosophy. There might be more in science, but that's because they're not as philosophically astute. because I can think of the only like hard like when I'm thinking of free will skeptics right now, the only one who's I can think of maybe two hard determinists. One would be Alex Rosenberg, and the other would be Sam Harris. But Sam
Mhm.
Harris is kind of a compatibilist too. He just doesn't like when Dennett talked to him about it. He's like, "Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense." But
Well, here's something you talked about, the emergent world, right? And
mhm.
this idea of emergent properties. My brother actually made a video about this concept of the emergent. And my thing is as I see it, if the emergent exists, if it's part of what constitutes reality, then premise one is false. Because in my mind,
Oh,
the emergent is part of reality, and we have to account for that.
I'll let Emerson take over this one because there are two types of emergence. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned Sean Carroll earlier, and I like his way of distinguishing it, strong emergence versus weak emergence. So weak emergence is not a problem for materialism, but strong emergence would be. So like if you're talking about like the kind of strong emergence that like a property dualist would accept, where you sort of put these material things together and there's some psychophysical law of nature that says that, these phenomenal properties naturally supervene on these brain states or something, but it's like the phenomenal properties themselves are irreducible. They're not just they wouldn't just be entailed by the lower level material description.
Do you have
Um,
an example or an analogy you could use to kind of describe
so
that?
like so the
Sorry.
like a if you think about weak emergence, like go back to weak emergence. So I've got this rectangular desk in front of me, and it's made of atoms and nothing but atoms. None of those atoms are rectangular, not a single one. So you've got something rectangular coming out of a bunch of non-rectangular things. So we could say like rectangularity is emergent here because on the lower level, you've got no rectangles, but you put together a bunch of atoms and you've got a big rectangle. So in that sense, you've got an emergent, weakly emergent property of something. And that's obviously not an issue for materialism. Strong emergence, on the other hand, is when you've got something over and above the sum of its parts. You've got some higher level phenomenon that uh, could not be deduced from the like description of the lower level phenomena.
Okay. And any examples of what something like that might look like?
Well,
And if you
I
don't,
mean, a lot of
you're on
people
the
don't
spot.
believe in emergence, so it's kind of hard to give non-controversial examples because like with emergence you have principles or forces or powers that are active at higher levels of organization that are not active at lower levels of organization, and that itself is a controversial claim that like Tarik wouldn't accept, like Sean Carroll wouldn't accept. So like they think that there's like the core theory of physics and like that's it, and other people think that when you get to higher levels of organization like biology, so like human beings or something like that, there are other laws of nature and principles or forces or causes or what have you that come online that were not online on those lower levels, and it's not the kind of weak emergence that I described with the table being rectangular. So not the reason it's hard to give an example of that is because a lot of people don't think there is strong emergence, so
Can I
there's
give an
not really a
example?
non-controversial example.
Well, here's one to clear it up. So he was talking about how most materials will reject strong emergence. So this will give people like Galen Strawson the idea, like, okay, I'll accept weak emergence, but not strong emergence. So consciousness would have to be something that was already in matter itself, because we can't have the strong emergence and still be a physicalist, kind of a thing. Some people, though, if they reject that, will say things like consciousness is emergent from material interactions, but consciousness itself isn't material. David Chalmers would be a proponent of strong emergence. If you agree with strong emergence, you're not a physicalist, though. You can say like maybe at bottom it started that way, but you got something non-physical out of it. Now that seems very counterintuitive, but they'll just say, well, maybe we'll just have to change around how we think about the laws of physics or something like
And
that.
that's kind of where I tend to fall. And in fact, I tend to, in my conceptualization of what I describe as the spiritual reality, is the reality that I'm describing that emerges from something that is physical and I think panpsychist, and then emerges from it. Now, obviously, Tarik, I think you and I probably don't see eye to eye on that, but but that's
Usually,
the way I
well,
conceptualize
correct
it.
me if I'm wrong, Emerson. I thought most panpsychists would deny strong emergence, right?
Well, it gets tricky. I mean, a lot of panpsychists don't think about the combination problem very deeply, so they are kind of they're kind of like, yeah, they wouldn't accept strong emergence, but I think that they don't realize that commits them to like a radical Luke Roloff style view. So then they end up I think they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, where they don't want to accept strong emergence, but they also don't want to accept the kind of reductionist panpsychism affirmed by Luke Roloff's.
So
Yeah.
you would accept strong emergence then? You personally?
I increasingly am more sympathetic to strong emergence. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm all weak emergence over here. So, yes.
So, well, that's interesting. So, I
Not
guess
that I think
going back,
everything is emergent. I do think there are some things that are fundamental, but lots of
and
things.
and I and I look again as I look at this, I would say that a lot of it does come down to how you define that which exists, which is a whole big question in and of itself. And I actually would say that to some extent, free will, um, it does sometimes boil down back to those even deeper questions, like you had asked me earlier, Tarik, like, what are you? Like, what is this me that's making the choices, right? And is that something that is emergent from more fundamental things? And I think that that's where, again, when I've had these conversations with my brother, for instance, that's where it goes. It comes down to things like, well, what is the nature of material and certain and or of the physical? And that conversation and the assumptions baked into it is what leads him to have certain positions, right? Now, I'm curious from a Latter-day Saint perspective and as a physicalist, two big questions that I have just kind of glaring at me in this is, how do you like, what are you saying that this thing is, the me that makes choices, is in a purely physicalist sort of worldview?
As of right now, it would be your brain. I think your brain is what is basically you. It would be the best thing to call you, I think, at this point.
Uh-huh.
Um,
And
so
doesn't the brain, like in that article, the guy talks about kind of that every synapse in your head, you can trace it back,
yeah,
like the chain.
it's got an evolutionary history. I don't agree. I mean, as far as on the physical processes side, I don't disagree with anything Sablonsky says. I mean, he's a world-renowned biologist. He's not going to get that part wrong. What he's going to get wrong is assuming that there can't be emergent. I mean, ultimately, I think there's something that hard determinists are trying to say, because they're really thinking that the only people that they're talking to are the libertarians, and they almost feel like the compatibilists aren't there. I notice this a lot with neuroscientists. It's kind of like our justice system seems to presuppose you have a certain degree of control over what you do, because it'd be kind of wrong to put you in jail if you didn't, right? So people like Sablonsky, people like Greg Caruso, who really don't like the justice system, they kind of are trying to put it like, okay, you don't have this radical libertarian version of free will, so therefore we need to reform the justice system because it's never really free or up to anyone what they do. Even though they could actually affirm free will and still change the justice system. I mean, that's what I think this is really boiling.
Well,
This is really
I'm
ultimately, because I noticed this, and I know correlation is not causation, but I noticed that all the people who keep writing this, it always comes back to, we want to change the justice system. It's like, okay, but you can do that and still affirm people have some control over what they do, even though maybe not all people do at a certain
don't
point.
you need to have the ability to actually make a choice to change the justice system?
Oh, well, you do, but it just wouldn't be a morally significant one. So there'd be no point in you praising it. I mean, the funny thing is they want to reform the justice system, but they don't want to take away Nobel prizes. Seems like that doesn't seem to make any sense to me.
Well, there's a part in the article, I'll read it here. And I think it plays right into what you're saying. In the article, it says, this is Greg Caruso. It says, who we are and what
Greg's
we
a
do is
friend of mine. So,
Oh, really? Okay.
yes.
Well, he says, who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of this, we are never morally responsible for actions in the sense that would make us truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward. I am in agreement with Sapolsky that life without belief in free will is not only possible, but preferable. Caruso is a co-director of the Justice.
What is that?
That's why I thought, I go,
Unbelievable.
like,
What do you mean preferable? And the other thing is, well, why should I care if it's preferable? Seems like that would be a free choice to like affirm or disagree, and like I'm disagreeing with you for that. Okay, again, we can let Caruso have his non-free will universe if he'd like to do that. But I think, but it shows exactly what I said. Caruso and Saplonsky, they keep going. You know, so they said ultimate. They keep going. That's what the libertarian kind of wants to say too. This is why these two are bedfellows. It's like the libertarian wants to say, yeah, you have the ultimate responsibility over what you do, and the incompatibilist, or the hard incompatibilist, not you're an incompatibilist, obviously. The hard incompatibilist will also say, no, you don't, and you need that. So they're the ones who said, like, you're going to have ultimate responsibility for free will, and the compatibilist is saying, no, you don't need that. You don't need to be the origin of the universe in order to have free will. That's a crazy standard. If you set the standard that high, of course, no one's really responsible for what they do. But why in the world would we set it that high? Because we have a hunch about it? No, it's probably stupid to do things on hunches. We should look at what we are, what we have control over, and that's how we can decide that thing. So,
and so it's interesting. I want to know how you guys sort of label me, because here's if I were to sum up my view on it, it's that human beings have influences on us. And those influences can limit our, what I call agency, our ability, like a child. And therefore, because of that, because there are influences under someone's control, you always have the ultimate ability to make your choice. But we recognize that if someone makes a choice under certain conditions, like you're 8 years old and you don't really know much better, and you do something terrible, the punishment and the justice demands that it has entailed with it are smaller because of that. So I do believe that we ultimately have the ability to choose how we respond to the stimuli that are given to us. But I do believe that those stimuli need to be taken into account when administering things like justice. So am I a total incompatibilist libertarian free will guy, or am I more of a compatibilist?
you actually, to me, Emerson, that sounds like a compatibilist. I don't see anything wrong with, because nothing in what you said entails that you have to deny determinism. That's what the incompatibilist would say. What you said was fully in line with certain versions of determinism. I think your view of free will is very similar to people like John Locke or David Hume or
but not hard determinism, not fatalism.
Yeah, I'm not a hard determinist that says if determinism is true, you don't have free will. A compatibilist would say if determinism is true, you could still have free will. And it seems to me you're more of a compatibilist. You might not affirm determinism. You're actually a lot closer to Emerson, is what I would say. You're not where I am, where I would affirm.
Why do me and Emerson end up on the same page all the time? And he's not the Latter-day Saint, and you are. Like, are we supposed to be on the same team?
I'm different than a lot of other Latter-day Saints, so I don't know.
I mean, that's why I appreciate.
What do you think? I would say Jacob's more of a compatibilist, frankly.
No, I think he's an incompatibilist based on other things he said. So I mean, like the geography here, if people are getting kind of lost in all the terms being thrown around, like the main debate is between compatibilists and incompatibilists. Compatibilists think free will and determinism can go together; they're not really in conflict, and incompatibilists think they are in conflict; they can't go together. And among incompatibilists, there are two groups: the people who believe in free will and the people who don't. So let's say you take that position. Free will and determinism are in conflict, they can't go together. Well, maybe you say, yeah, and since determinism is true, we don't have free will. Or you could make the opposite inference and say, well, since we have free will, determinism is not true. So like Jacob's an incompatibilist, Sam Harris is an incompatibilist, but they have opposite views. So still the debate is between compatibilists and incompatibilists. It's just
And I
among
think,
incompatibilists you have Sapolsky, and you also have, you know, libertarians.
would you say though that it is a would you say that hard determinism is, because when I talk, I guess a lot
That's
of
like
this is coming down to
Sapolsky and
determinism.
Sam Harris. That's just an
Yeah,
incompatibilist who thinks there's no free will.
But
and
they
that's fine.
affirm determinism.
I see, and I guess that's it. I guess I have a hard time with sort of this soft determinism. Like when I'm talking about determinism, I'm talking about hard determinism, and I do believe that's incompatible. I think any form of soft determinism is ultimately compatibilism.
Yeah, that's right. Soft determinists are a type of compatibilists. They're the ones who affirm determinism and free will. Now, if you take no position on determinism, but you would say it's compatible with free will, then you'd be more like Emerson or Dan Dennett. If you affirm determinism and free will, you'd be more like David Hume or Sean Carroll.
Got it.
And can I just say about Sapolsky's book, and some of the motivations that you guys were talking about, like Greg Caruso trying to reform the justice system? I mean, the main issue with Sapolsky's book is just in the title. It's called Determined, you know, and he's like, well, you know, determinism, you know, like look at these like sociological and biological and neurological causes, you know, like they influence our behavior. You know, we're determined, so we don't have free will. But I mean, that is a fringe position. The idea that determinism is incompatible with free will is ultimately a minority position. You know, like something like 80% of philosophers believe in free will. You know, 60% of philosophers are compatibilists. The other, like roughly 20% are libertarians. And then, you know, there are some kind of undecided people. And I feel like free will skeptics, you know, they're like a, you know, 10%, maybe 11% in philosophy, which has got to say something. But there is this like sort of disconnect among like the philosophical discourse among people who like, you know, write articles and books about this kind of thing, and just like, you know, the popular level discourse about it. But, you know, speaking to the reforming the justice system thing, like think about how reform has happened in the past. Like human beings used to crucify each other in front of other people. And that was like part of like, you know, part of the punishment for breaking the law. It's pretty hard to imagine, but it's like that people, they were just like us and they did things like that. So how did that stop happening? Did people stop believing in free will? Greg Caruso and like Robert Sapolsky, like, did they say like, oh, you know what? I just realized nobody's actually free and everything is determined. And then we stopped crucifying people. No, like people, that's not like you have all these major justice reforms and it doesn't happen because people stop believing in free will. It's like it, even if you're successful, it is the most roundabout imaginable way to achieve your goals.
I don't know. My take is it's a totally incoherent thing to say, because if you want to reform something, that entails that you are making a choice to reform it. Like the reason progress is only possible if people have the ability to choose to do other than like if the future is determined and is going, it can't be otherwise, then I don't know. I have a very hard time seeing how someone who's like,
Yeah,
we need to make the choice to change the justice system, but we don't have the ability to choose.
Yeah, it's a real pickle for Greg and Saplonsky. Luckily, these people are not on the Supreme Court or President of the United States. I'd be really worried. As long as they're confined to their classrooms and kept away from the general public, I think we're fine.
Well, he's not being kept away from the general public. He's going around promoting his book and his views, you know, on every podcast in existence.
Luckily, no one's going to read the book because it's so long. Unfortunately, being the glutton for punishment I will actually read the book. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of you, Jacob. You have a view that's very close to Michael Huemer and kind of having a lot of common sense direct your epistemology and how things go. So I can see that's why you could have that intuition. I just don't think empirically that's going to work. I'm not
a hard empiricist.
What?
And I guess that's because I'm not a hard empiricist.
Well,
unlike someone I know here.
that's also the case with Emerson. So, you know.
Some good company. Hey, if you have, do you have another 10 minutes? I wanted to go one last question.
Yeah,
If you guys don't mind, are
got
you?
about 10 minutes. That'll work.
Okay, cool. And I wanted to direct this one at you because I know that my brother's going to watch this, and I know he's going to be like screaming about this. Is you believe in free will, yet you reduce what you are to the brain. So how does free will emerge from the brain?
Oh, that's a good question. Over the brain is an evolved thing. It's uh, gotten different kind of characteristics and things like that. And along the evolutionary path, as we've kind of uh, developed certain things, of able to pick certain things out, being able to adjust, that's kind of how we've gotten free will through evolution. Kind of the same way we've gotten our sense of sight, our sense of smell, and other types of detections. There's no mystery about it. It's just part of the evolutionary process. It's just
So
free will is as natural and evolvable as 20/20 vision and things like that.
So with a for instance a computer. So do you subscribe to the analogy that the brain is essentially computer-like in its functionality and the way that it works?
No,
You don't.
I think
Interesting.
I think it's a bad analogy. It's a good analogy in the sense of saying you can think of something that's purely physical that can think or do things, kind of, which is what Dennett and Fodor and others have tried to do. But I'm not a computationalist. No, I don't
I see.
think that's
Interesting.
I don't think that's the way to think about it.
So is there a better analogy that we'd use for the brain, or is there anything that's even analogous to it?
I mean, I think first of all, the problem with computer is a very, very broad thing, that can go from like, a typewriter to a iPad or something like that. And those are all different things. I would say that humans are like self-aware robots would be more of a better way of thinking about it. Think of it this way. If you're shooting off a rocket, I don't know if you're into fireworks or things like that. Do you like fireworks?
I
Okay.
am.
If you're shooting off a firework, it's all law governed. It's just going to go towards target. You can obviously shoot things at people, sadly. But unfortunately, those types of things, they have the ability to move out of the way and things like that. So, model rockets, they don't have free will. If you compare that to something like Mars rover, if it comes to a rock or if it comes to a ditch, it can kind of look back, analyze the situation, say, okay, if I go over here, it'll do this. If I do this, and now it's still a law governed system, but it doesn't just say, screw it, I'm just going to shut down. It still has some autonomy. And that's where like higher level functioning Mars rovers would be what I would say.
Okay, so you would say that, I mean, Mars rover though, isn't that ultimately a computer that's doing that? You just think that we're at there's another level of computation at which
Yeah,
things
I mean,
aren't just cause
the
and
problem
effect?
with the computer analogy is kind of a computer is something that's made by someone to do a particular thing whereas evolution doesn't have a purpose in that sense. It's not top down, it's more ground up. So again, this is an analogy, but I don't like the computer analogy. The mind is more complicated than a computer.
Got it.
So
Well, I agree. Emerson and I are shaking our head about the mind because we wouldn't reduce it to just that. But I can see what you're saying.
I know this is a family-friendly channel, so I can't fully express my views about that mind is a computer stuff. But let me just say, I find it very implausible, and it makes me very frustrated when people compare the mind to a computer. And it just seems like one of those things that is so obviously culturally influenced, where it's like, people used to talk about, like, 17th, 18th century materialists used to talk about the mind as like a big machine of gears and pulleys and like the most advanced technology of their time. They're like, that's what the mind is like. They think that analogy is somehow going to shed light on it. And then now we're doing the same thing with computers. And it doesn't matter how unlike the mind or even the brain is from a computer, people will still say it. And they truly, really believe they're saying something profound and insightful and true when they compare the mind to a computer. And it's just like, yeah, I find that view very implausible, to put it mildly.
Awesome.
Yeah. I don't know if we had talked about this, and I don't know if you'd want to talk about, but had you wanted to talk about the difference between naturalism and physicalism, or is that not.
Yeah, we've thrown around some of those terms. Let's talk about that for a minute. If you want to kind of outline that real quick for people.
Well, Emerson and I are both naturalists in that we agree that there's only one world. But I think the world is just nothing but physical processes and physical events and physical things. Whereas
And
Emerson,
when you say, just for the layman who's watching, by world, you don't mean the planet Earth. You're
right,
talking about
the
in the
totality of everything
philosophical
like
test.
this.
Exactly. Okay. Just want to make sure the lay audience understands.
Right. Not the Earth. Although the Earth is a physical thing too. But so, in other words, even though I think that there are things like minds and free will, and actually, no, I don't think persons exist, but that's another subject. I think those are all purely physical. So let me rephrase that. I believe that there are persons, but there aren't enduring selves. So that'd be another way of saying it. But Emerson would be a naturalist, but not a physicalist.
So the idea here is that naturalism, if I'm not, let me see, I actually had it says, under naturalism is the idea that only natural laws and forces as opposed to supernatural ones operate in the cosmos.
That's right. I don't believe in anything supernatural.
Okay. And it's funny, I would actually agree with that.
Well, there you are. So
I guess I'm a naturalist as well. But that's because I think that there's definitional problems with the idea of supernatural, but that's a whole other discussion. Emerson, you are a naturalist, but not a physicalist. You want to explain that distinction?
Oh, well, I just think the mind, specifically phenomenal consciousness, is irreducible. Like, it can't be reduced to the physical. So, I think consciousness is real, like the mind is real. And I just don't think that physicalism is true. So, physicalism or materialism is just the idea that all there is, the stuff described by physics, and ultimately everything is going to be reduced to that, once we have the grand theory of everything. But I don't think that if you start with a really austere, sort of toolbox like that, just kind of the mathematical gnomic description, the structure that's given to us by physics, you're just not going to get something like phenomenal properties ever. Doesn't matter how you put together physical things, you're never going to get phenomenal properties. It would be like getting concrete objects out of abstract objects. And Tarik is agreeing because he thinks phenomenal properties aren't real. And that is where physicalism leads, by the way. The really consistent physicalists, they end up eliminating the one thing that can't be an illusion, the mind, because that's physical. I mean, physicalism does kind of inextricably lead to this, or you're going to have to buy into some really implausible type B physicalist kind of solutions where you believe in these brute necessities that are totally unprecedented in nature. And
well, I gotta clarify then. I do not believe everything reduces to the laws of physics ultimately. So I guess that I believe, and maybe I'm just a confused person, but I would say that I'm a naturalist in the sense that I don't believe in the supernatural, but I would not say that I'm a physicalist in that I believe that everything that exists within nature reduces to what can be understood through the laws of physics. If that,
I think Blake Ostler would agree with something like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So usually if I'm with Blake Ostler, I feel like I'm in good company.
Yes. No.
Well, awesome. Well, any other thoughts before we wrap this up?
Oh, well, last thing I would also say, I think one other reason Emerson's a naturalist but not a physicalist is he also believes in moral law and moral truth, which couldn't be reduced to physics. Is that right?
I don't think that really bears on it. Like, I feel like when it comes to abstract laws or like abstracta in general, I think, I mean, you can be, well, I'm an ethical non-naturalist, so I think that, these like moral laws are like irreducibly normative truths, and they're not concrete objects, they're abstract objects. So like I feel like if you're a physicalist, I don't feel like it's really off limits to believe in abstract objects. You can be a mathematical Platonist or something. Like, I mean, some people talk about physicalists like they can't believe that, but I don't see any issue with that. And like, I know my friend Shane Wagner, he's He defends physicalism often, and his version of representationalism involves realism about abstract objects. So I feel like not only can you be a physicalist who doesn't think that, you know, the natural world or like the concrete world is all there is, you know, the abstract world actually factors into some physicalist explanations like his representationalism. Um, so yeah, I mean, I like Felipe Leon's way of characterizing naturalism, where you've got conservative naturalists like Tarik. They believe that you know, there's the stuff described by physics, the concrete stuff described by physical science, and like that's all there is. And then there are these kind of moderate naturalists who believe in that, and they also believe in abstract objects, like maybe they're mathematical Platonists, or like me, they're moral realists, and they think that there are these irreducibly normative truths. And then there are liberal naturalists who believe in all that plus some concrete things that most naturalists would not sign on to, like you know, like you could be a naturalist who believes in like ghosts or something. Like you just think that there are additional concrete things that most naturalists are skeptical of. So you'd be on
A
the
lot of
liberal
a
end of
lot
the
of
naturalist spectrum.
a lot of Latter-day Saints would fall into that category with a belief in spirit being material, which is something
Mhm.
that's kind of beyond our normal natural way to grasp. So
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting distinction. I'll have to remember that. Naturalist essentially is the rejection of anything what would be constituted as supernatural, but physicalist would say that all of that which is natural reduces down, or at least can be understood in terms of the laws of physics,
Mhm.
once fully understood, I guess.
Yeah, and I actually have a couple of videos on my channel about naturalism, and also about, I think I have 2 videos about naturalism. The thing is, like, ultimately, these kinds of, you know, struggles over conceptual analysis and trying to come up with the perfect, necessary, and sufficient conditions of a term like naturalism is just never going to happen. It doesn't matter. It's never going to happen for what it's worth. Like, these terms are ultimately undefinable, and it's not a problem. It doesn't matter. So anyway, that's for a topic for another time. But um, before we go, do you mind if I say one more thing about free will?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to go back to like the central issue here, free will, what I take free will to be is a kind of significant control you have over your actions. And I think that maybe, you know, plausibly another condition necessary for free will is alternative possibilities. I'm not really married to that, but let's just grant it for the sake of argument that, like, to have free will, you have to be in control and you have to have multiple options open to you. Okay, well, those are not incompatible with determinism. So, like, uh, anyway, like you can have epistemic possibility. So you can have alternative possibilities just in the sense that, for all you know, you could have done otherwise. So, like, if you're rolling a pair of dice, you know, it could come up 1 through 6, right? But you don't know which one it's going to be. Now, even if we accept that determinism is true, you know, so it's, if it comes up a 2, well, it was always going to come up a 2, right? But like, there's still kind of randomness and indeterminacy as far as we're concerned. So I think there are compatibilist friendly notions of indeterminacy, you know, and of alternative possibilities. So you can still have alternative possibilities if you really think you have to have that. Um, and secondly, you can obviously be in control or not be in control. Like, I've felt the difference, you know, phenomenologically, of like being in control and not being in control, and there is a difference. And we, you know, that factors into our assessments and evaluations of people's responsibility. So there's still a distinction, even if determinism is true, between voluntary and involuntary, between intentional and unintentional, between being a reason responsive agent and not being reason responsive. You know, so like someone who has an irrational fear, like if they're agoraphobic, they can't go outside, they are less free than me because they have this irrational fear that limits what they can do. Okay, so you still have reason responsiveness and non-reason responsiveness, still voluntary and involuntary. You still have virtuous people and, you know, non-virtuous people. So, you know, I just don't think that any of this is really a problem for the determinist. I just feel like free will and determinism are compatible. You know, so I this is what Michael Huemer was talking about when he said whenever anyone tries to really analyze free will and give a consistent definition of it, it always turns out that the definition people come up with is compatible with determinism. So that's a major thing that compatibilism has going for it, in my view.
Excellent. Any other thoughts, Tarik?
No, I think we've summed it up pretty well. I would I guess I'll to your audience some books maybe they could read if they want to get up on this further. If you would like to read a good defense of compatibilism, highly recommend Elbow Room by Daniel Dennett. That's up there. If you want a good introduction to just this, an entire survey of free will and all the possibilities, then you can use I recommend a book. It's only about 150 pages. And it's very concise. It's called An Opinionated Introduction to Free Will by Alfred Mealy. He's one of the great experts in free will.
I'm going to need to look into that one.
And if you want the hard determinist case in very good layman's language, then I would recommend this book, The Atheist Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg. But you don't need to read the whole thing.
Any of it. You don't have to read any of it, actually.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to do that either. Hold on. And just read chapter 5 and chapter 6.
And you can also steal Robert Sapolsky's book because you can't be held responsible for your actions. So you don't have to feel bad about
it. I think that the reason I gave those more other ones was because Sapolsky's is really long and you need a lot of biology to read his book from what I can see from the table of contents. So
yeah, and, he debated Michael Huemer actually recently about free will, and it was a little bit underwhelming. I mean, like his he really is not like, if I can be like kind of blunt for a second, like Sapolsky is like a philosophical novice. Like his expertise is way outside of the like philosophy of free will, and like it really comes out when he starts talking about it.
Yeah,
but that's why I recommended Mealy and Dennett, because they're very well versed in neuroscience and Leibniz experiments and things like that. I guess there's a book by Daniel Wagner. It's called The Illusion of Freedom. That's another book that's defense of hard determinism. So
excellent.
Those
and now, where can people find you guys? Emerson, one more time, plug away.
Emerson Green on YouTube, or if you prefer listening on podcast, you can look up Walden Pod or Counter Apologetics.
Very cool.
On Twitter, you can find me at Real Scientistic, and then my blog is einsteinforeveryone.substack.com.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you guys for coming on. I know it's been kind of a late evening for you guys, and I appreciate it. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while, and I think it was great. So thank you guys for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.